Hey everyone, and welcome to A Different Atheist Reads, History of God by Karen Armstrong. I'm Christy, and today we're going to wrap up Chapter 2. Before we start, I want to talk a little bit about the break. So I'm going to be taking a few weeks off of this series to catch up on a few other things. So I will be back doing A Different Atheist Reads on the 26th of February. To prepare for this video, what I did was I went back and I watched all of the videos about Chapter 2. And it was a good idea, and I'm glad I did it because this series is awesome. I think about what I knew about the Bible when I started Chapter 2 and what I know about it having done Chapter 2. And I know so much more about the Bible now. It's sort of like when I learned German by immersion. Complete immersion language schooling. So I would begin in class 4 hours a day, all German, 5 days a week for 3 weeks at a time or 6 weeks at a time. It was incredibly painful, but I also learned more German in 20 hours in a week than I could have, if I'd spread it out over months. That's kind of how I feel about this chapter. So going back and watching it sequentially, I realized that I was really frustrated with Karen for a lot of this chapter, and maybe this is part of the impetus behind the break, is to just get some distance from this. But in the video today, what I want to do is just go over some critiques of Karen's Chapter 2 and what I think she's trying to do. Then I want to say what I think was actually interesting about what I discovered in the process of preparing for Chapter 2. And then finally, I want to go over the attributes just so we can get a sense of where Yahweh has come from in terms of his development since the beginning of the chapter. So what did I think of Karen's Chapter 2? Well, having looked back and given it quite a lot of thought, these are the conclusions that I have come to. But first, having spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was going on in the chapter, this is my read. I think what Karen did was, when she was constructing this part of her story, she deliberately selected writers or pieces of writing that would help her form a narrative that justifies her view that the experience of God is creative, that it is personal and subjective, that it is fluid, and it basically doesn't have any kind of external reality that we can find, and that's her position. So she wants to talk a lot about creativity and art and the numinous and emotions and all these sort of fuzzy woo-woo kind of things. So in order to do this, what she does is she selects the prophets who make, so she basically skips most of the early parts of the Jewish writings in order to get right into prophets. And she wants to focus on the prophets because they have a moral message. They also have a message about idolatry and moral purity, but of course Karen's focus is morality and empathy and connection. And I think that's basically what she does, is she starts with the people who make her case the best and use them to frame the entire chapter. And then from there, she goes on and sort of sticks everything in as a consequence. And I think that this really does a great disservice. One, it ends up really not being about a history of God. She throws in things about the Greeks in there, and she's still making comparative references to Eastern traditions. So the part of the problem with Karen's chapter is that she doesn't have a good idea of what God is in her head. And so, having done a lot of work on this now, it's pretty clear that she doesn't have a clear idea of the directionality of communications, because she has both people making Yahweh say things and Yahweh trying to influence people to do things, but not in a complementary or consistent way, in a way that basically makes them sound equivalent, which is bullshit. And that's what I'm kind of taking away from this particular chapter, is the way that Karen has manipulated parts of the stories and cherry-picked particular authors and certain themes that allow her to tell the story that she wants to tell. The last thing I want to say about Karen's chapter itself is to point out, because this will be the only time in the book I think I can point out, Karen had an opportunity in this chapter to actually look at women's relationship with Yahweh. Because the Hebrew texts are the best opportunities where women have personalities and they have roles and they have dialogue. That is sometimes, it's always around men and always revolves around men's lives, but they do show some independence. we've got Deborah and other examples of women trying to take charge of their own lives within the Yahwehist tradition. And she just doesn't give any voice to those women. And it really disappoints me, because it's really the only opportunity we were going to have in this book to have that kind of location of women's voices within a text that puts them on par with men. And she didn't take it. More tea. How would I have written this chapter, knowing what I know now? Well, I obviously would have had a very different take. I would have had a much clearer take. And the question is about a history of God. Karen doesn't really give us anything to nail or hang our hat on, as it were, in the course of the chapter. She just sort of does these wandering, rambling things. So I would have first had a very clear idea of the arc that I wanted to demonstrate throughout the chapter. And I do think that the best way to start with that, as Christine Hayes mentions, is to talk about what the Bible is and what it isn't. That it isn't a single piece of theological work, that it does include things like laws and wisdom literature, that it's not all original, that it's highly influenced by other works, and it actually incorporates other works, and it draws on the wisdom of pagan neighbors and other traditions, and really set the stage, because I think we tend to overemphasize these writings because we have them and they're so ubiquitous in our culture, that the great thing about the Hayes series, in my mind, was she really showed that they were just another culture. They weren't particularly special, other than they were monotheists. And I think that understanding that has been vital for me to really get a better appreciation of the text. I would have made more specific the notion of progression over time, and I would have started with the P and D sources, and I would have been looking at notions of morality and idolatry and God's physical location, his geographical ties, and how that plays out in the P and the D school. And then I would, move on to compare that with the later prophets who were taking up these earlier positions and questioning them and transforming them, creating more humane slave laws as part of the tradition, creating a new moral paradigm that does not spread punishment out over generations. And a lot of this gets missed in Karen's discussion, because she's so focused on the interpersonal subjective experience that she's losing the bigger picture, in my view. Another thing that I think Karen really misses in the book is the opportunity to point to key moments where the transition of what was, a Yahwehist cult into a religion of Judaism had some, it looks like, really key points. One of those points would have been after the discovery of the speech by Moses, or the text that was alleged to have been by Moses, and the centralization of all worship in Jerusalem, because this makes that it's a peg, it's knocking out one of the foundations of the idea that Yahweh is territorial by not doing rituals all around you, but centralizing and having to go to the temple to do these kinds of offerings. That centralization was a unique feature that determined the course of Jewish history, because once you did that, when there was an exile, people didn't have practices to fall back on, and that forced a conceptual transformation. If you could only do sacrifices in Jerusalem, well then how do you practice your religion outside of that area? And that led to a second innovation. So I think there's actually quite a lot in the history of God that is really interesting and deep, and could be looked at in terms of the structures, not just the agents, but the structures of change, and how the authors were using these structural changes to interpret their own history. And that's what I feel like the perspective that the Hayes series has given me, is to look at it more from a structural point of view, from the systems, the economic and the political, the social systems. That's really the things that are making the Bible interesting to me, and the coping mechanism of the people, the followers who are are meeting challenges and then having a crisis of faith and finding solutions to solve that problem. Karen does talk about it, but her emphasis, as we have heard repeatedly, is a blanket rejection that these people were trying to be logical or scientific or in some way conceptually rigorous and consistent. And that's because I think because she's so focused on rejecting that, there's a lot of things she's not seeing. So in terms of the attributes, I would say that if we look at Yahweh in chapter 2, and I think I don't really like to use the word God for a lot of reasons that I could go into, but one, it sort of assumes monotheism where there's no evidence for monotheism. It also kind of universalizes a lot of disparate beliefs. So when we talk about God, we could, that could apply to the Jewish gods, Allah, to Christian God, whatever else, and yet it's all banged into this one word. So I'm going to call Yahweh Yahweh because that's his name, and that's the religious tradition that we're working within. So in terms of Yahweh's development over the course of chapter 2, I think we can see that his omnipotence has increased and his constraints and his limitations on his power are decreasing in the eyes of the authors. We're also seeing his omnipresence increase and his ties to local or spatial places like a sanctuary are decreasing. The monotheism of the tradition is increasing. Not only have they moved now from we want to worship Yahweh to the exclusion of all other gods, but they've moved into no other gods exist but our God. And that obviously is an increase in monotheism. God is becoming increasingly transcendent, more distant, as opposed to, when he was walking in the cool of the day in Genesis, now there's the semblance of the appearance of the presence of the Lord. And so we're seeing that increasing distance, which is kind of, again, set against a not too distant history in the time period of God occupying a sanctuary just down the road. So this is an evolution of thought. We're seeing the holiness in terms of the priestly tradition coming through and the holiness text. We see that the ritual and these kinds of notions of profanity, holiness, common, spiritual objects are now part of the tradition. They're in the priestly text, they're in the priestly source, and these notions are still with us in terms of moral purity and God punishing the people of a land or God leaving the people of a land is still very much with us today. In terms of God's justice, I would actually argue, based on the evidence of the Christine Hayes series, that we're seeing less of an emphasis on God as being supremely just. And that's because in the Deuteronomistic worldview, justice happens within a lifetime. And that worldview is being challenged and rejected by people who are reading Job and siding on the side of Job. And also the notion of God's justice not being current or in the same temporal frame as us, but it's an afterlife kind of thing, does seem to me to be moving away from the concept of immediate justice. In terms of God's moral emotions, Karen does make the case for the notion of God's goodness and the demand for mercy being on the increase, and I think that that's a fair notion, so I'm going to concede that the passages described in chapter 2 show more of a compassion for insiders and some outsiders, slaves as well as people within the community, foreigners, as well as members of the faith. That the calls for justice and compassion are improved in terms of the comparison to chapter 1. Marty! With these comparisons, I think we can see that there has been real distinct character transformations within the text about Yahweh. But more importantly, I think it's important to recognize that this is not a story about a single object. What we have are lots of people's perspectives on God over time. And I've pointed to this in previous videos, how these notions of if you have a personal moral fault, you're putting the community at risk and God will punish everybody because of what one person does as a sin is found in these texts. That notion is also rejected in these texts. And the idea that Yahweh would punish a people for the wrongs of individuals is also something that we see rejected, and that no, God will only hold you personally accountable. And then we also have the idea that there is no moral justice and things happen, and stop thinking that it's all about you. So I think that this has been a very interesting exploration. The chapter itself, if you just read it, you would not get this much out of it. So the series has been really good for me. It's been very draining. It's not unlike preparing for a course. And I've noticed in the last couple of lectures, I just call it lecture now. I don't even call it like a video. I just call it a lecture because it feels like that's what I'm doing. And I don't mind. That's what I do. I enjoy doing it. But it's also probably why it's been taking some energy out of me and why I need a bit of a break. That being said, I do want to keep up the quality. I don't know what we're going to face in future chapters, so I don't know that everyone is going to be as well researched as chapter 2. Please don't use that as the bar that you set for me. Please just, whatever I come up with, trust that I've done a good job, and don't judge it by chapter 2, because I put a lot of work into this chapter. It was like 6 videos that I've watched twice at least, just to prepare. So it really was intense, but very enjoyable. And I think we've seen real progress in terms of conceptually where we started in the book and where we're going. So that being said, I think this is about enough for your time. I'm gonna be getting off here as well. Boy, that sounded bad. So yeah, I will see you guys back here on the 26th of February with a new episode of A Different Atheist Reads. I will still be doing my series, An Atheist Asks, so please keep a lookout for that. And I will be posting videos. I think I'm just going to do a new series on deconversion research, and I'll move videos that I've done related to deconversion over to the new playlist. But it's kind of going to become its own category on the channel. So you can watch for that probably by the end of February, starting in March. I hope to have that all finished up and ready for release to you guys. So from me to you, thank you so much for your watching and your subscriptions and your views. I've been Christy. You have been amazing and awesome, and I'll see you guys in a few weeks.